This video will change the way you think about 3-bet pots forever. I want to start us off with a hand. You're playing as button versus big blind in a 3-bet pot. Pre-flop, you opened to 2.5 big blinds, and then big blind 3-bet to 13 big blinds, and you simply called. On the flop, this opponent checked, and now you are holding king jack of clubs and deciding what to do. Would you check here, or would you bet here? Checking, of course, is the intuitive play. You are holding a fairly safe second pair, but it might surprise you to learn that the solver will actually mix between checking and betting with this hand. Furthermore, as I'll teach you today, betting is actually probably better versus most opponents. I want to welcome everybody to this video series. My name is Chai, I am your professional poker coach. I aim to make pro poker simple. These are long, technical videos where I distill years of professional practice into a condensed video. These videos are quite long, so to make sure you don't forget to watch the full thing, hit the subscribe button below. And with that said, the topic of today's video is going to be playing as the 3-bet pot in position pre-flop caller after the out-of-position player checks on the flop. This is a common poker spot that a lot of people struggle with, but it's also a spot where we can play quite exploitatively. In my experience coaching students, a lot of people struggle here as the in-position pre-flop caller in this line specifically because there's a lot of money on the line and it is quite tricky to play. It's also fairly understudied. But in my view, we can gain a massive edge here by understanding the theory of the spot as well as a few exploits that work versus so many opponents. I'm going to teach you both of those things. The theory for optimal play in this position, as well as a few key exploits that will help you win. In order to accomplish this, I'm going to walk you through a few solutions, as well as a PowerPoint presentation that I've prepared for you. To follow along and not get confused, I've included the download link to the PowerPoint presentation on my Discord. Let's jump in and help you dominate those 3-bet pots. To keep things nice and tidy, I want to start us off with a quick table of contents. The first thing we're going to very quickly discuss is the pro poker thought process, as well as how 3-bet pots differ from single raised pots. If you're just tuning in to this video series for the very first time, this is going to contain crucial information about how we want to approach poker in general, as well as some specific notes pertaining to 3-bet pots. If you're tuning in after watching some of my previous videos, then you'll know that this is information that I've already discussed. If that's you, but only if you're fully aware of what these points are, then you can skip through this section. Afterwards, we're going to dissect the theory for 3-bet pots as the in-position pre-flop caller after your opponent has checked on the flop. This theory is not only specific to 3-bet pots. We're going to learn some general concepts that apply to poker in general. And today, we're going to do things a little bit differently from the way I've done things in my previous videos. Instead of diving right into how different hand classes play, I want to set things up by discussing a few strategic incentives that we have in theory. After we discuss those incentives, then we can take a much more detailed look that will absolutely help you dominate your opponents. We're also going to talk about a bit more information today than I discussed in my other videos. In my previous videos, I've mainly limited the strategy to the flop, but today we're also going to talk about how different hands play on the turn. There's a few really good and important strategic themes that I have planned out for today, and I think they work best when we have this really nice flop and turn view. Afterwards, we're going to get into the most profitable part. Exploits are everything in poker, especially in today's topic. There is one giant point that is important to be aware of when you are trying to exploit your opponents in poker, and that is that the level to which you should exploit your opponent depends on 3 key factors. The first factor is their skill. This is self-explanatory. If you're playing versus a bad opponent, you can exploit them a lot more than you can exploit a better opponent. Most poker players have a decent understanding of how to play common spots quite well. For example, people are usually much better at playing single-raised pots than they are playing 3-bet pots. People study single-raised pots a little bit more, and 3-bet pots tend to be a bit more trickier technically. That's why I think it's important for me to make this video in general. The next factor is the EV of the exploit, and this in part has to do with the size of the pot. So if your opponent is playing very poorly, but the pot is very small, there's not a lot of money that you can gain by exploiting them. On the contrary, if the pot is very big, even if your opponent is only messing up a little bit, there could be a lot of money that you can make against them. So it's kind of like how much your opponent is messing up multiplied by the size of the pot. The final factor is the rarity of the spot. This is pretty important because if you're playing versus the same opponent over and over and over, you can't really exploit them all that much if the spot is quite common. It might only take them a few hours of playing against you for them to understand what you're trying to do. For example, if you are c-betting 100% of the time on the flop because you think they overfold, a lot of good opponents, especially at higher stakes, will notice that and then start raising a lot versus your flop c-bets. But today we are talking about 3-bet pots as the in-position preflop caller after your opponent checks. The note I have here says, we are playing in a 3-bet pot, which means the pot is very big, and our opponents only check on the flop around 15% of the time. So this is a very rare spot. As I've mentioned before, people don't study this specific line all that much, which means that most people have low skill in this spot as well. All of these factors together strongly indicate that you can make a lot of money here by exploiting your opponents. Compared to the previous topics discussed in this video series, in today's topic, both on the flop and on the turn, we can really play quite exploitatively. This, of course, means ditching the solver strategy to a large degree and just playing what is most profitable based on mass data analysis as well as specific player tendencies. I'm going to talk about a few mass data exploits. Because that information is so valuable, I ask that you go to my website in order to receive it. On the website, you'll be asked to enter your email, and then the video will be delivered to you 100% free. As always, the video you're watching right now will be a lot more theoretical, and the video that will be delivered to you is a lot more practical and exploitative. The link is down below, even if you don't plan on watching that exploitative video right now, which I highly recommend you do. Get it delivered to you so that you don't forget to watch it later. But now let's dive into the pro poker thought process, as well as a few points about why 3-bet pots are different from single raised pots. Let's start with the pro poker thought process. If you're tuning into this video series for the very first time, it's important that you watch this. If this is already very familiar to you, then definitely just skip ahead to the theory. The pro poker thought process is the specific step-by-step approach that I want you to have every single time you're playing a hand in poker. We need to have this detailed, formulaic step-by-step approach in order to avoid some common errors and to just have a solid blueprint for defeating our opponents. This thought process is really just you asking yourself 3 questions in order. The first question is, what is the strategy with my range? The second one is, what is the strategy with my hand? And the third one is, what is the exploitative way to play my hand? I think the distinction between the first 2 questions and the third one is very clear. You obviously just want to understand the solver strategy for your hand before you start building exploits, but there's also a specific reason why we ask question 1 and then question 2, instead of just jumping to question 2. In poker, it is incredibly easy to have tunnel vision into your hand. It's really easy to just get to the flop and think only about how your hand plays. This has massive consequences because in poker, we're not trying to play hand versus opponent's range. We're trying to play our range versus our opponent's range. So by having tunnel vision into just our hole cards, we're neglecting all other hands in our range, which causes us to make mistakes. In fact, I firmly believe that the most common poker mistakes come from people just neglecting what their range looks like in various spots. For instance, people will usually bet too many strong hands and not realize that they have a very weak checking range. Good opponents are then able to pick up on the fact that your checking range is weak, and they will be able to exploit that weak checking range by betting very big or bluffing a lot, but usually some combination of the two. By constantly drilling that step-by-step process, it's a lot more difficult to have tunnel vision on your hand. If you just start by thinking about how your range plays, the strategy with your hand naturally follows. So instead of getting to the flop and thinking to yourself, oh my god, I have a strong hand, I have to bet, you'll more accurately understand spots where your strong hands have to check in order to protect other weak hands in your checking range. Of course, that's just one example, but that basic principle applies to pretty much everything in your range. If you messed up that hand at the very start of the video, that was an example of maybe you tunnel visioning onto a medium strength hand and not understanding the fact that this hand has to bet because your range has a particular strategy. We're going to talk about that strategy today. The next point I want to briefly discuss is how 3-bet pots differ from single-raised pots. I did cover this exact information in my previous video in this series, so if you watched that, you don't have to watch this one again. For all the new people, I just want to point out that in single-raised pots, we should often think about hand classes instead of specific hands in our opponent's range, but in 3-bet pots, we should do the opposite. What this means is that when we are playing single-raised pots, for instance, button versus big blind, we need to think about how they're going to play all of their second pairs or all of their third pairs, instead of thinking about how your opponents are going to play individual hands, like Jack 10 or 10-9 if it's like second pair or something. In single-raised pots, ranges are really, really wide, so it usually doesn't matter how they're going to play individual hands. What matters is how they're going to play broad hand categories in general. So some exploitative reasoning might focus on stuff like, how is your opponent playing weak pairs? Or how are they playing their weaker top pairs? In 3-bet pots, however, ranges are really, really narrow. This means that specific hands like Jack 10 or 10-9, which again are second pairs in this example, will actually be a large percentage of our opponent's overall range. There are many instances in 3-bet pots where specific hands are something like 15 to 20% of our opponent's range. Thus, in 3-bet pots, it actually does make a lot more sense to think about how your opponent is going to play specific hands. It's just something that's very crucial to be aware of in-game. Now that we've covered that incredibly important information for first-timers, let's start talking about theory. As I mentioned at the start of the video, to be crystal clear, today we are going to talk about the flop and turn strategy in 3-bet pots after our opponent checks on the flop as the out of position pre-flop raiser. Our opponent has checked on the flop, and we will now dissect the theoretical incentives as well as strategy from this point onwards. We're going to do that in a logical step-by-step process. I've broken down the strategy into a few different categories. The categories have two factors, so they will be high boards versus low boards, and also the strategy as under the gun versus small blind compared to the strategy as button versus big blind. So there's 4 total categories. There's going to be high boards as small blind versus under the gun, high boards as big blind versus button, and then low boards for each of these two. The reason why we want to look at these different formations in addition to the board height is because these formations will play very, very differently from each other. This is due to some preflop differences between these two formations. Let's take a look at under the gun versus small blind preflop. This is, of course, under the gun's opening range, and this right here is small blind's 3-betting range. What's really important about this one is that the 3-bet range is quite linear. This means that small blind is only really supposed to 3-bet some of these strongest hands and very few polar bluffs. Looking at under the gun's calling strategy, you'll see that they are mainly calling some of these strong offsuit combos, as well as a lot of pocket pairs and some suited connectors. So if we just tab between these two and look at them side by side, we can see that the general trend is that small blind's range is quite condensed to all of the stronger stuff, whereas the in-position preflop caller's range is very, very condensed towards a lot of this middling stuff. You can treat other positions exactly the same. If we take a look at cutoff versus small blind, we will again see that small blind is 3-betting with a very strong range with a lot of these combos, and then cutoff's calling range will be again, just a little bit more condensed towards this more middling area. They're lacking the ace-king suited, they're lacking the pocket kings, lacking the queens to some extent. And although both ranges are a little bit wider in small blind versus cutoff than in small blind versus under the gun, the general pattern is still very much there. If we look at button versus big blind, however, the ranges will look vastly different. Button will open a very wide range, and then big blind will actually 3-bet a very, very different range. I've just highlighted the hands that big blind raises with, and in addition to a lot of this strong stuff, you'll see that there is so much clutter. There are a whole bunch of bluffs and random hands like king 10 offsuit, queen 9 offsuit, queen 5 suited, jack 7 suited. we would call this a much more polar 3-betting range preflop. And if we just take a look at big blind's calling range, you'll see that it is quite wide, and it is no longer really condensed in this middling area. They have many more unpaired strong hands like ace-9 suited, king-9 suited, and that's where the bulk of the preflop caller's range is. Because this is such a different pattern to small blind versus under the gun, this is definitely a separate factor in our analysis. To truly understand the solver strategy, we will first discuss theoretical incentives and then talk about range composition by hand class. So we'll try to figure out what are the solver's goals in any given spot, and then we'll talk about how hand classes play. The incentives will be a strong strategic backbone, and then range composition by hand class is just going to fill in the details and help you play so incredibly well versus even seasoned opponents. Seasoned as in good, not as in salt and pepper. As I mentioned today, we're going to take a slightly deeper dive into the strategy, and we'll start with the flop play, and then we'll talk about the turn play, which I haven't done before in the video series. I hope you guys will really like that. So let's dive right in. If you're not planning on watching the full rest of the video right now, I highly encourage you to subscribe in order to finish the video later. Let's go. Let's discuss the theoretical incentives, starting with flop play and then turn play. Understanding the solver's strategic incentives will help us answer question 1 of the pro poker thought process. We'll just understand how the solver thinks a little bit, which will help us understand how our range wants to play. From there, we'll figure out how our specific hand wants to play. So we're just generally interested in what the solver is trying to accomplish here by betting hands like King-Jack. To understand incentives, I always like starting off by taking a broad look at how the solver plays on a whole bunch of different flops. In the software that I'm using, we have a really easy way to do this by clicking over here in the Reports button. This opens up the menu that you're looking at right here, which just displays the general flop strategy on all of the different possible flops. We're looking at this bar right over here, and the green represents how often the solver checks, and the light blue shows that the solver is betting for a small bet. Just scrolling through the menu, you can see that in button versus big blind, in general, the solver strategy is to bet around half the time for one of these smaller bet sizes after the opponent checks. In general, in button versus big blind, this is the strategy that we want to go with, and we'll take a deeper dive into the specific range composition a little bit later. I have a second tab open, which shows the flop report for under the gun versus small blind, which is something else that we'll dissect today. You can see that scrolling through the flop report, under the gun is playing quite similarly in general. Under the gun is usually checking around half the time, and also using that small bet when it decides to bet. So in very broad terms, after our opponent checks on the flop, as the in-position pre-flop caller, we want to bet around half the time with our range and usually use a small bet of around 33% of the pot. On higher boards, we will sometimes use a larger bet, maybe around 50% of the pot, but we're never using 75% of the pot or greater. One important strategic point is that when the solver likes using a small bet, it means that the solver is interested in betting a lot of weaker hands, like King-Jack on Ace-King-7. If the solver preferred to check with King-Jack, it would like to use a more polarized strategy and probably bet a little bit less often on the flop with its range, and also use a larger flop bet. When the solver is betting frequently with a lot of weaker hands and is primarily using a smaller bet, we would call this a merged betting range. What our broad analysis has revealed so far is that solver likes to play this merged strategy after the out-of-position player checks on the flop. There's a good reason why the solver is using this merged strategy on the flop, and it boils down to a few different incentives that we can write out on paper. Going back to the pro poker thought process, this again helps us understand how our hands should play, but learning strategic concepts also has the benefit of teaching you how to exploit your opponents. Once you understand the reason why your opponents should be doing something, it's really easy to exploit them when they're not doing something. So although this section is very technical, it's also going to give you the most benefit when you learn it. So let's talk about a few different reasons why we might want to use this small merge strategy on the flop after our opponent checks. First of all, our basic incentives for betting are to build the pot and to also deny equity. Building the pot is generally better accomplished when we use a larger bet, because we're obviously putting more money into the pot. But the second point, denying equity, is very well accomplished by a small bet. Essentially, what this means is that we can make a small bet with a lot of weaker hands, and we can get our opponent to fold a lot of hands that have a high chance to improve versus those weaker hands. If we take a look at how the solver plays on Ace-King 7, we can see this concept in action. We have a whole lot of weak hands that are interested in betting for a small size, hands like 8-7 and 7-6 of spades. These hands are primarily using that small bet, and they are denying a lot of equity when they make that bet. If we take a look at how our opponent responds versus a small bet, you'll see that they will fold a lot of their overpairs, like pocket nines, pocket tens, pocket jacks, as well as many overcards like Jack 9 and 10-9. Getting a lot of these hands to fold is actually very beneficial for 8-7 because it sort of preserves the hand strength, and it only costs a little bit of money to make that bet. This is known as denying equity. What's very important to note is that on the flop, we have a massive opportunity to deny equity because there are 2 cards left to come. On the turn, denying equity is still going to be a contributing factor to the overall strategy, but it will generally be a smaller factor because on the turn, there will only be 1 card left to come. On the flop, building the pot is also not a massive priority because we still have 2 more bets that we can make on the turn and on the river in order to bet very big with our strongest hands and get paid. So on the flop, it's not essential to really bet big and start building the pot right away. That's definitely a big reason why the solver prefers a small bet on the flop. Now those are the general basic incentives for the solver strategy on the flop, but there's also one additional advanced incentive that is especially important to know for 3-bet pot play. That advanced incentive is that we are also trying to not have an exposed checking range. So what exactly does this mean? Let's just go back to Button's strategy and take a look at what the overall range looks like. Button has a lot of strong hands like sets, 2 pairs, and strong top pairs, but there are very many weak hands in the range, like second pairs and third pairs. Second pairs and third pairs are about 40% of Button's range in general. And if you think about it, these hands actually require a lot of protection or babysitting from the stronger hands in Button's range. Hands like King Jack or King 10 have a lot of EV, but they're really not interested in building the pot and just prefer to go to showdown as cheaply as possible. In poker, it's very tricky to do that because we are not the only person who decides how big the pot gets by the river. Even if we check, our opponent has the opportunity to bet big on the turn, or bet big on the river, or on both streets. That would be absolutely disastrous for hands like King Jack or King 10. These hands have a lot of EV now, but they will lose a lot of EV if our opponent bets very big on those streets. The worst case scenario for our medium strength hands is for our opponent to go all in and make our hand indifferent versus that bet. If our opponent is allowed to bet very big with their strong hands, then our hand at best is going to turn into a bluff catcher. In essence, hands like King Queen, King Jack, and King 10 have a lot to lose if our opponent makes a very big bet on the turn or on the river. I like to call this concept the most to lose concept, and it is extremely important in 3-bet pots. In order to prevent our opponent from betting very big after we check, we have to balance out our betting ranges and our checking ranges in a way that causes our checking range to not be terribly exposed. If we think about it very basically, our checking range is going to have some ratio between medium strength hands and then very strong hands. If there are too many medium strength hands in our checking range, then our checking range generally becomes too weak, and our opponent could really punish those medium strength hands for checking too often. So the solver ensures that the ratio between medium strength hands and strong hands in the checking range is unexploitable by sometimes betting with the medium strength hands and by sometimes checking with the strong hands. Again, this is a little bit technical, but it is extremely important to understand. One big reason why you see more medium strength hands like King Queen or King Jack or King 10 bet on the flop in 3-bet pots is because our opponent's range is usually very strong in 3-bet pots. In single-raised pots, ranges can be really, really wide. Both players can have a whole lot of garbage. But in 3-bet pots, if we mess up this very delicate ratio, then our opponent's strong hands will turn into absolute powerhouses that will crush any EV that King Queen or King Jack have. We have to be very careful and very protective in 3-bet pots. That is why it is so deadly to make this error of always checking with these medium strength hands, and also why it's so profitable to master 3-bet pots, because most players, especially at lower stakes, are not aware of this concept. Because the solver likes to bet a lot of these medium strength hands on the flop, it is a bit more inclined to use the smaller bet size with its range. We're kind of forced to bet these medium strength hands, and obviously a big bet size doesn't match their strength. At least with a small bet, we can still get called by like a weaker pair every now and then. And there is one final incentive why the solver likes to bet small on the flop. It is the fact that we also have to keep in mind that the out of position player has a range advantage pre-flop. So just going back to the solution, Button also doesn't have hands like ace-king or pocket kings or ace-king offsuit here. Instead, the value hands that are interested in building the pot are a little bit weaker, and weaker hands obviously prefer to use a smaller bet size. So our range prefers to use a smaller bet size. That covers the incentives for the flop. Let's now take a closer look at how different hand classes play on a few different boards. Alright guys, so I'm going to simplify how different hand classes and our range plays on a few different flops. We will start with high boards as button versus big blind. The point of all of the material that I'm about to cover is to learn just the rough solver strategy for a few different hand classes. It's not to memorize this information or try to mimic it exactly in-game. In poker, it's always better to study concepts instead of memorizing specific information, and this is no different. So with that said, as a very broad simplification, on high boards as button versus big blind, our best strategy is to use this 30% pot size bet around 50% of the time with our range. We'll start with how our strongest hands play. Our 2 pairs plus are betting around 70% of the time. Our overpairs are going to be very rare on high boards, but we can just always bet them when we have them. And then our top pairs are betting between 30 to 80% of the time, depending on their strength. Stronger top pairs will bet more often, as we'll see in just a second. Let's dive into a specific board to see these hands in action. We are looking at button strategy on Ace King 7 Rainbow. This is the same board from earlier. So just highlighting these strongest hands, you can see that sets and 2 pairs are mostly betting, but there definitely is a little bit of slow playing happening. Slow playing usually comes from any sets or 2 pairs that interact with that top pair card. Ace 7 is sometimes checking, pocket aces is checking quite often, but King 7 and pocket 7s are always betting. And that's going to be the case for most boards. Next up, let's take a look at our top pairs. You can see that our strongest top pairs, Ace Queen and Ace Jack, are betting very often, but then it sort of levels off and decreases as we get into like the Ace 5, Ace 4, etc. Just like with our second pairs, it's still important to bet these weaker top pairs at a small frequency, but obviously our stronger ones are betting a lot more often. It's very important to note that these hands are still sometimes checking, and this is again just to balance out that checking range and prevent our opponent from exploiting the weaker hands in our range. Let's take a look at how those weaker hands play. So second pairs will bet around 30% of the time, and low pairs will also bet around 30% of the time, except that we can now bluff with very weak combos a little bit more often. On Ace King 7, this is quite clear, so our second pairs are betting around 20% of the time, the stronger ones are again betting a little bit more, just like the top pairs, and then the third pairs and low pairs are still betting around 30% of the time, but there is a very clear pattern to be discussed here. When we look at these hands, usually these stronger pocket pairs will have a preference towards checking, and we're only starting to bet hands like pocket 8s or 7-6, pocket 6s, just generally the weaker ones. A lot of this has to do with equity denial, because these hands can definitely deny a lot more equity than something like pocket jacks. But we also start to run into this threshold where our hands like pocket 6s and pocket 5s aren't really clear showdown value hands. We're starting to get into bluffing territory because these pairs are so weak. Especially when the board has 2 Broadway cards on it, it's quite difficult for us to have a lot of bluffs here because the ace definitely makes the top pair, the king makes the second pair, so where do our bluffs really come from? And in this scenario, the solver will actually start bluffing with hands like pocket 5s, pocket 4s, and pocket 3s quite often. Diving into our bluffs, the note I have written here says that everything without showdown value bets around 50% of the time, and our best bluffs can bet a little bit more often. That's definitely the case on Ace King 7. As I mentioned, we don't really have too many bluffs because the ace and the king are blocking a lot of our air, right? So instead of having like king 10 that is just king high, king 10 is second pair on this board. So the bluffs that we do have end up betting quite often. Queen jack is betting, obviously that's a draw, so it's quite easy to understand. But even hands like jack 9 of hearts are betting at a very, very high frequency. Typically, more connected combos like queen jack will bet a lot more often, but also combos that are just lower in this part of our range are going to bet a bit more often. If you think about the blockers of these hands like 6-5 and 5-4, they're really not blocking a lot of folds. If we take a look at how our opponent plays in response versus the small bet, the majority of their folds are coming from hands like pocket jacks, pocket tens, queen 9, jack 9, and although 5-4 does not have a draw here, it at least does not block those folds. I like to think of this as kind of like a reverse L pattern, because if you just draw out the blockers of 5-4, it's going to block these hands and these ones, but it entirely misses like this region of our opponent's range. I think that's a pretty intuitive way of thinking about it. Just one final point about that showdown value. I switched the board over to queen 7-3 flush draw, and if we select those hands, you will see that the stronger ace highs are not really bluffing. This is what I meant when I said in the notes that anything without showdown value bluffs, hands like ace 10 and ace jack, have showdown value, so they're inclined to check a little bit more often. But again, just like the second pairs or third pairs, these hands are still betting sometimes in order to not have an exposed checking range. Next up, I want to discuss how we're playing on high boards as under the gun versus small blind. Earlier in the video, I explained why small blind versus under the gun is strategically very different from button versus big blind. So although the flop incentives are more or less the same, they kind of play out a little bit differently, and that's why it's important to discuss this separately. So playing as under the gun, after small blind checks on the flop, our best strategy is to bet between 30 to 50% of the pot, around 40% of the time. Few differences here. So first of all, we are using a larger bet size a bit more often. This is still considered a pretty small bet. This is only half of the pot. And we're also betting a little bit less often, only betting 40% of the time. Previously, in button versus big blind, we were betting around 50% of the time. I think the reason why we're using a larger bet and betting a little bit less often as under the gun versus small blind is definitely worth discussing. We are looking at the solver strategy on ace 5-4 flush draw. Small blind has checked on the flop, and this is now how the solver plays. There's two main reasons why the strategy is a little bit different from button versus big blind. The first of those reasons is because as under the gun, we actually do have more strong hands in our range. If this were a button versus big blind spot, we would not be holding any ace king or ace king offsuit. We would have a lot more weak hands like ace 9, ace 8, and ace 7 in our range, which prefer that smaller bet. As under the gun versus small blind, we are missing the hands that like to bet small, and we are holding a lot more hands that prefer to bet a bit bigger. The second reason why the solver plays a little bit differently here is because we are now playing tighter ranges, and our opponent has more strong hands in their range. When we were playing as button versus big blind, we could bet small to deny a lot of equity from overcards, and we could get at least a little bit of value by betting small with hands like king jack or king 10. In this case, it's quite difficult for us to get called by worse when we're betting hands like pocket queens or pocket jacks, and because those hands require a lot more protection, we just have to start checking a lot more of our stronger hands, and therefore our overall betting frequency decreases. Right, so more strong hands is why we're betting bigger, and also our opponent's range is stronger, which is why we prefer to check more in general. Even so, the overall strategy is very similar to button versus big blind. Let's take a look at hand classes, again starting with the strongest hands, and there's actually very little that changes from before. You can see that 2 pairs plus are still betting around 70% of the time. Overpairs will be very rare, but you can just always bet them as a simplification. And the only real change is that top pairs will just generally bet a little bit less often. The previous instruction was to bet them between 30 to 80% of the time. We now just tone it down to 20 to 60% of the time. We can go back here. So our 2 pairs plus are betting around 70% of the time. Again, anything that doesn't interact with that top card is just betting always. And then we're slow playing some ace 4 here. And just highlighting our top pairs, you can see that we are betting the stronger ones a lot more often, and these weaker ones are only betting like 10% of the time here, but the stronger ones are still definitely slow playing at a decent frequency. Again, we just want to have a broad overview of how different hand classes play, so it's really not important to memorize these instructions, just very, very broad overview. Let's take a look at those medium strength hands. So our second pairs and low pairs are still betting 30% of the time, and we can still bluff with more weak combos. Going back to ace 5-4, I'm just going to highlight our under pairs, second pairs, and low pairs to show you this. Just like on the previous board, our stronger under pairs prefer to check a lot more often, and then as we get weaker and weaker, same concepts from earlier apply. These hands are betting a lot more often because this is kind of where our bluffing threshold is. Again, just talking about bluffs, things are quite similar to the previous example, but there is a slight difference that is worth mentioning. I wrote down that the worst bluffs almost always check, and now the best bluffs are only betting around 50% of the time. On the previous board, Ace-King-7 played as button versus big blind, we saw that our bluffs were all betting at a relatively high frequency, but now our worst bluffs are almost always checking when we are playing as under the gun versus small blind. You can see that King-Jack is only really betting when it has at least a backdoor flush draw, but the weaker bluffs in our range have very nice blocker properties, so they are not blocking folds, whereas hands like King-Queen of diamonds or King-Queen of clubs is definitely blocking a lot of folds. Big point here, when both players' ranges are really tight, we have to be quite selective with our bluffing combos. Alright, so as you guys know, in this video series, I like to do drills to try to keep things a little bit interactive, especially for these very technical parts. So let's do a drill to seal the deal. In this example, we are playing as under the gun versus small blind. Small blind has checked on the flop, and we are holding ace-king offsuit. Follow that two-step thought process from the pro poker thought process, and let me know in the comments how often you would bet your hand here. Again, first question you want to ask yourself, how does your range play here? Second question you want to ask yourself, how does this specific hand want to play? Pause the video, try it out, go ahead. All right, hopefully you've done that. I'm going to attempt to figure this one out. Question 1 for myself is, how does my range play? I know that in early positions, I'm usually going to use like 30 to 50% of the pot. We're going to go with 50% here, and we're only betting around 30 to 40% of the time here. We're quite interested in betting our strongest hands, but we'll definitely be slow playing a lot of them. And many of our weaker pairs like King 10 will still bet here quite often. We are holding a bluff, and we know from early positions, we want to be pretty selective with our bluffs. Here, we're obviously drawing to a very strong straight, so I'm going to assume that this hand is betting around 40% of the time, and we'll just go with this medium bet size for today. So that's actually pretty close. This combo is betting just a little bit less often than 40%, but I'm definitely still within that rough ballpark, which is really about as well as you have to know your theory here. So I'm super happy with this one. Let me know in the comments how you guys did, and we'll move on to low boards. Alright guys, let's talk about the strategy on low boards, starting with big blind versus button. Luckily for us, the strategy does not change very much when we look at small blind versus under the gun later. Our best strategy here is to bet 30% of the pot around 50% of the time. This is roughly the same simplification that we used on high boards, but the hand classes play quite differently now. Starting with the strongest hands, our 2 pairs plus are still betting around 50% of the time, our over pairs are betting around 80% of the time, and our top pairs are also betting around 80% of the time, but the stronger ones are betting a bit more often. In general, on low boards, as button versus big blind, we are betting our stronger combos a little bit more often than we would be betting them on high boards. You might think that this would increase our overall betting frequency a lot, but you have to keep in mind that the majority of our range is not going to be top pairs. To see this in action, we are looking at the solver strategy on 963 Rainbow. And as you can see in this filters tab, or just by looking at the range viewer, the majority of our range are going to be ace highs, king highs, and no made hands. This is where our checking range comes from, and in particular, we'll see later that we have to put a lot of effort into protecting the strongest ace highs. And as I mentioned, we are allowed to bet our strongest hands quite often. Our sets are always going to slow play at some frequency. Hands like pocket 9s and pocket 6 here are checking around 30% of the time. Our over pairs are betting around 80% of the time, and we are betting these weaker ones a little bit more because they gain a bit more protection. And our top pairs are also allowed to bet very, very often. On higher boards, we saw that the strongest ones would be betting only like 80% of the time, and then the weaker ones would only bet 20% of the time. But on low boards, because we're gaining a lot more protection, and because we have fewer of them, we are allowed to bet them a lot more often. Next up, let's talk about our second pairs and low pairs. Again, when we compare how they play on low boards to how they play on high boards, you will notice that they are betting a lot more often. Second pairs are betting 50% of the time on low boards, and low pairs are betting 40% of the time. Just going to highlight them right over here. Under pairs, second pairs, and third pairs are all betting a little bit more often. This has to do with protection and hand strength. On lower boards, hands like weaker pairs are a little bit stronger because the majority of our opponent's range also misses this flop. Remember from before that their range was very largely concentrated in this region, so they're going to have a lot of hands like ace-queen, ace-jack, and of course this completely misses 9-6-3 rainbow. These hands are now overcards, and we can actually deny a lot of equity to those hands by making a small bet with second pairs and low pairs. Next up, let's see how our bluffs play. So we are betting around 50% of the time with our air, and many overcards will bet. We will prioritize betting connected, non-showdown value combos. This is a little bit tough to execute, so it's important that we take this deep dive in order to get this right. I'm going to select the ace highs, the king highs, and the no-mate hands, and this is how these hands play on 9-6-3 rainbow. You'll notice that our strongest ace highs will check quite often. Hands like ace-jack of clubs, ace-10 of clubs have a lot of showdown value, and they're not really interested in betting. On low boards from late positions, this is often what our checking range is centered around. But of course, we have a whole lot of overcards in our range, and those overcards will be our bluffs. I talked about this a little bit in my previous video, but overcards are very nice bluffing candidates because they have two opportunities to improve to a new strong top pair. Queen 10 could hit a queen or a 10 on the turn or on the river. Bluffing is always a little bit better when we have less showdown value, and we also prefer to bluff with any hands that have the potential to make a straight. So you'll notice hands like 10-8 or Jack-10 are betting a bit more often than hands like King-10 or King-Jack. Whenever you're looking at the solver strategy, there's always going to be a few hands that don't really match the rule. For instance, 10-8 suited is betting a little bit less often than Queen-Jack suited, but again, we're just trying to understand things very broadly and very conceptually. The way we actually play in-game should be a lot more exploitative, so our knowledge of theory should definitely be advanced, but it's not important to have this extreme level of precision. Next up, let's take a look at how things change when we're playing as under the gun versus small blind. Luckily, things are very similar to button versus big blind. Our best strategy is once again to bet 30% of the pot around 50% of the time. And looking at my notes here, there are very few things that actually change. Our two pairs plus are betting around 70% of the time, and our bluffs are still betting around half the time with a priority on connected, non-showdown value combos. What does change in particular is the fact that our overpairs and our top pairs will bet less often. In button versus big blind, they are betting around 80% of the time, but in small blind versus under the gun, these combos are only betting around 50% of the time. Our overpairs also prefer to bet a bit more when they are stronger. In addition, our second pairs and low pairs do prefer to check a little bit more often. Now, all of these pairs, the overpairs, the top pairs, the second pairs, and the low pairs, actually have something in common, and that is the fact that they get devalued in early positions. If we look at the solver strategy on 6-5-3 flush draw as under the gun versus small blind, we can see this effect in action. Just selecting the overpairs, you will see that hands like pocket kings and pocket queens are still betting quite often, but our weaker pocket pairs like pocket eights, pocket tens, and even pocket jacks are actually checking quite often. These hands have a surprisingly low amount of equity in early positions. You can see that pocket tens only has 60% equity on this board. That is very low for an overpair on the flop. This makes a lot of logical sense when you consider small blind's range. If we take a look at small blind's response versus a small bet, you'll see that the majority of their checking range is centered around a lot of stronger overpairs in addition to these overcards. All of these stronger pocket pairs are never folding versus the small bet. In fact, they are raising quite often. So pocket jacks is in a lot of trouble when it bets and it gets called or it gets raised. Because of that, hands like pocket jacks and pocket tens strongly prefer to check as under the gun, and that is a major strategic difference in under the gun versus small blind. As I mentioned, our top pairs, second pairs, and low pairs are also checking a little bit more often in small blind versus under the gun for the exact same reason. Our opponent has a tighter range, and therefore these hands prefer to check a bit more often. Finally, just to really solidify that bluffing point, I want to select the ace highs, the king highs, and the no-mate hands. Again, I think it's really difficult to get the bluffing strategy perfectly right, so that's why it's important to just look at a bit more in depth. You'll see that our very strongest ace highs, our ace king suited and ace king offsuit, do prefer to check, but then everything else is generally weak enough to bet in under the gun versus small blind. So even ace queen of clubs actually doesn't have all that much showdown value here, and we are lacking bluffs, so it's more than fine to bet this combo, and then of course all the other overcards are betting around half the time. There's still a general priority on hands that are a bit more connected, or hands that have less showdown value, like 10-9. So we've summarized the main points here. Just to repeat them one final time, in early positions, we have less showdown value with a lot of these pairs, and so they prefer to check a bit more often. Let's now head over into a drill to seal the deal. We are looking at a button spot facing big blind after big blind checks on the flop, and this is actually a paired flop. Now, low paired flops will follow the exact same heuristics that we've just discussed, with the exception that on paired boards, usually our weaker pairs will have a little bit more value because it's really difficult to connect with the board on paired flops. Both players will have a lot more error, therefore weak pocket pairs will be worth a little bit more, so they will bet a little bit more often. The other guidelines regarding the strong hands and the overcards are going to be basically identical. So again, follow that pro poker thought process, ask yourself those two questions, and let me know down below how often you think the solver bets this hand. Go ahead, try it out. Okay, hopefully you did that. I'm gonna try this one out myself. So 10-4-4, right, so obviously my range is gonna use a small bet size and probably bet around 50 to 60% of the time. And we are holding overcards, which do share a suit with the board, which is often gonna be quite valuable, and don't have all that much showdown value. Based on those factors, I'm gonna estimate that my hand is gonna bet around 40% of the time. Looks like I got it pretty spot on again. Let me know in the comments how you guys did. We have now discussed the strategic incentives as well as how different hand classes play on the flop, both from early positions and from button versus big blind. In the previous videos in this series, I have ended the analysis around here. But today I want to go one step further for you guys and discuss a few points about turn play so you don't get confused there. We are again going to discuss the general turn incentives, followed by a few deep dives into some boards. Before we do this though, I want to share a few freebies that I have on my website. Linked down below, you can get 2 100% free guides. The first free guide is 3 data-driven exploits that work at 10NL all the way to 1KNL, which are based on powerful and robust mass data analysis. In addition, not only do I tell you what these exploits are, I actually spend time in this document discussing why they work and how to adapt them to your own game. So if you like this video and you like my theoretical thought process, check this document out because it contains my exploitative thought process. The second freebie I have on my website is my modular warm-up builder. I strongly believe that taking your mental game seriously and just taking poker seriously in general necessitates a good warm-up routine. I think that most poker players would jump at the opportunity to take a magic pill that increases their performance by even 10 to 20%. Warming up regularly between your sessions only takes 15 to 20 minutes, and it has the ability to do that and so much more. A good warm-up routine will not only improve your performance in poker, it will actually create a mental bubble around your poker sessions, which stops you from overthinking the game even after you've closed the tables. Poker is a marathon and not a race. Get this free warm-up builder right now to increase the quality of your poker sessions and not burn out. Check the freebies out, both of them are highly valuable, and there's also a lot more content on my website. Link down below. But now, let's talk about that turn strategy. Alright guys, let's talk very briefly about play on the turn. In general, we want to play very exploitatively here. As the 3-bet pot in position pre-flop caller, we only face a check on the flop around 15% of the time. We will only bet around 50% of the time after our opponent checks, and our opponent will only call around 50% of the time themselves. 3-bet pots are also generally quite rare, so this turn spot is going to be very infrequent. The pot is also going to be quite big, and most opponents have no idea how to play here. So we want to play very exploitatively here. As I mentioned earlier, I have a highly practical exploitative follow-up video on my website. Still, I think it's highly valuable to understand the solver strategy on the turn because it teaches us some important strategic concepts and also helps us play well versus very skilled opponents. So let's start with the theoretical incentives. Our basic incentive on the turn is now to build the pot. On the flop, one of our key incentives was to deny equity, but this is less important on the turn because there's only one card left to come. In addition, after betting small on the flop, it becomes very important for us to bet big on the turn and really build the pot with our strong hands. We only have 2 streets left to build the pot, so betting bigger becomes a bit more important. Even so, we should still not have an exposed checking range on the turn. Especially in early positions, there will be a lot of medium strength hands that make it into the betting range, and a decent number of strong hands that prefer to check. In 3-bet pots, a lot of medium strength hands take highly unusual lines, and it's important to get a rough sense of what those are in order to not have an exposed checking range, and also to recognize when your opponents have an exposed checking range. Again, the reason we study theory is twofold. We want to prevent our opponents from exploiting us, and we want to get better at exploiting our opponents. Hopefully you already have a decent sense of how the solver is going to play on the turn based on just these points. Let's now take a deeper dive into 4 specific turns to just understand what the strategy looks like on a more precise level. Unlike before, I'm not really going to categorize boards and then discuss the percentages of different hand classes. That becomes very difficult to do on the turn because there are so many possibilities. Instead, we're just going to look at 4 case studies, which I find particularly valuable. Our first case study is going to be the double Broadway board played as button versus big blind. In all of these examples, we are assuming that we bet on the flop and our opponent called. So here we are looking at button's strategy on the turn after betting small on king, jack, 7 flush draw. The turn is the 4 of diamonds. I understand it's a little bit hard to see with my webcam, but you can still make it out. And so the first thing to notice here is that we are primarily betting bigger than we are on the flop. On the flop, we bet small, but on the turn, we strongly prefer the 75% pot size bet. I would say that overall, this strategy is very palatable and it is easy to understand what is happening. Our strongest hands are betting quite big because they really want to build the pot, and our medium strength hands will prefer to check at a higher frequency. I think what's really important to understand here, though, is the fact that the medium strength hands are still betting around 30% of the time. If we highlight the second pairs, the under pairs, the third pairs, and the low pairs, you'll see that hands like ace-jack of clubs and pocket eights and 8-7 are still betting at a decent frequency. Usually the higher ones like queen-jack and jack-10 are going to be checking a lot more often, and you can see that jack-10 is only betting when it has that flush draw. Still, it's really important to understand that pocket eights and pocket sixes are betting in order to prevent the checking range from being too weak. If you never bet with any of these weaker hands, then your checking range will be exposed and you will be exploitable. On the flip side, if you're playing against someone and you know they're never betting with their pocket eights or their 8-7 here, then the way you would want to exploit them is to just overbet on the river as big blind. You basically get the opportunity to bet really big with your stronger hands because there's nothing your opponent can do. Bluffing is also a little bit tricky in theory, and it's difficult to identify specific heuristics besides the fact that, again, the more connected combos are going to bluff a little bit more. So you'll see that ace-queen is obviously bluffing a lot more because it has the opportunity to improve to a strong straight. Even so, small blocker effects are going to cause hands like ace-queen to play very differently from queen-10, even though if you're just looking at them from a distance, it seems like it's more or less the same thing. I don't think blockers are terribly important when it comes to bluffing, and instead I like to play very exploitatively here. If your opponent's range looks slightly different from the solver range, then the optimal strategy becomes very different, so the fact that your opponent is not playing the solver strategy should cause you to deviate from the solver strategy yourself. So definitely play very exploitatively here. Next up, I want to look at ace-high turns played as under the gun versus small blind. In this example, we again made a small bet on the flop on ace-7 for a flush draw, and the turn is the queen of diamonds. Here, the overall strategy looks very different from our first case study. On the turn, under the gun is only using 33% of the pot and only betting around 40% of the time. The reason why under the gun is using a small bet size on this turn is actually very interesting. In fact, this is pretty unique to this specific turn card. If we switch the queen out to a jack, you will see that the solver uses a medium bet size. is now using 50% of the pot instead of 33% of the pot. So there's definitely something very interesting happening with that queen turn card. And this actually has to do with small blind's range. If we go back to their range on the turn, you'll see that it's actually very concentrated around ace queen offsuit, and pocket queens. In fact, they have so many new strong hands on this seemingly innocent turn card that they should be donking around 30% of the time. To me, this highlights the very high importance of understanding specifically what your opponent's range looks like at every stage of the hand. It takes a lot of practice to be able to identify that the queen is a bad turn card and the jack is not really all that bad, but understanding this definitely gives you a big edge over even high-stakes poker pros. Luckily, there are a few patterns that are fairly common. This happens to be one of them. If you're playing versus an opponent who does not donk, which is going to be basically everybody, then it's totally fine to just check your entire range on the turn, or if you want to play exploitatively, just bet your strong hands and don't bet anything else here. In terms of range composition though, the solver is definitely betting a lot of its strong hands, sometimes slow playing the 2-pair, sometimes slow playing the stronger top pair, and it will definitely continue to bet a lot of these weaker pairs as bluffs. Next up, let's take a look at a low stays low turn played as button versus big blind. This is 7-4-3 rainbow, and the turn is the 3 of clubs. And in my view, this is kind of like the best case scenario for our range. We bet on the flop with a lot of marginal hands, and those hands do not get devalued on the turn. So our top pairs here and our over pairs are still pretty strong, and they continue to bet at a pretty high frequency. Still, we're slow playing some of our strongest hands, so pocket queens and pocket aces are checking sometimes. Some of our full houses are checking, but pretty much everything else is betting. If we take a look at top pairs, under pairs, and second pairs, all of these combos are still pretty strong on this specific turn. Now, if we were playing on the same board in under the gun versus small blind, things would be quite different because our top pairs would not even be strong on the flop. Right? When we were discussing the flop strategy, we saw that there was a very big difference in how those medium strength hands played. So if this was an early position spot, the strategy would look a lot different and there would be a lot more checking. What's really important to pay attention to, again, is how all these ace highs and king highs and no-made hands play, because this is a massive chunk of our overall range. Right? If we just sum it up, we have 20% ace highs, we have 20% king highs, we have 20% no-made hands. This is like 60% of our overall range, I believe. Now, obviously, I think in-game, it's a lot more important to just play exploitatively on the turn, but I just want to point out that this is the solver strategy with these hands, and this is important if you're playing versus a very good opponent, or maybe if you're trying to just create your own exploits versus a specific opponent. I think in general, most people will underdo this frequency because it's really hard to bet often enough with hands like Jack-9 suited or Queen-Jack suited. It's quite easy to just check too much, especially because we're quite inclined to naturally check with our ace highs. We feel like hands like Ace-Jack are just too strong to really bet on the turn. And if a low turn is the best case scenario after betting on a low board, then an overcard, especially in small blind versus under the gun, is the worst case scenario after betting on a low board. So that's what we'll look at now. So here we are playing as under the gun versus small blind. The flop was 6-5-3 rainbow, and the turn is the king of diamonds. So this is very clearly a tricky spot to be in, because our flop betting range had a lot of overpairs in it, and these overpairs get devalued on the king of diamonds turn. A lot of people struggle with their overpairs here, especially because they bet them too often on the flop. If you recall from earlier, hands like pocket 10s and pocket 9s were supposed to check very frequently, and therefore if you have them too often, you'll feel like this turn card just messes up your entire range. And there's also something else that is a little bit spicy about this turn card in particular, which we'll get to in just a second. But first, I want to take a look at the range composition. So the strong hands are again just betting. They're very interested in building the pot. Our top pairs aren't terribly strong, but they still definitely want to bet. Our bluffs are also pretty self-explanatory. Anything that's connected, anything that doesn't have a lot of showdown value is just betting. But again, I think a lot of people mess up with how they play their weaker pairs on this turn. On this turn, the biggest hand class that you have are going to be under pairs at 36%. And it's really tempting to just always check with your hands like pocket 9s or pocket queens, but you can see that the solver still bets them around 25% of the time. This bet is again important in order to not have an exposed checking range. If you always check your pocket queens and your pocket 7s, then that checking range becomes exploitable. In addition, as I mentioned before, most players will get to the turn with too many hands like pocket 10s and pocket 9s, which makes their checking range really, really weak. Right, so again, note that if you're playing a small blind and you suspect that your opponent is making this very, very common mistake, you have to exploit them on the river. So now that we understand the range composition, I want to reveal the secret to you. And that is that this entire strategy goes entirely out of the window because your opponents are not donking on this board, most likely. That spicy bit of information is that small blinds should be donking quite often here. And a nice thing to memorize is that on a lot of ace overcard, king overcard, and queen overcard turns, the out of position player, especially in early positions, should donk at a high frequency. I guess only the ace overcard and the king overcard here. Makes a lot of sense because their calling range is very, very condensed to ace king and ace queen, and those hands improve on this specific turn. Again, if your opponent is not donking here, I guarantee you most people are not, you can just check with all of your bluffs and your medium strength hands here, and only bet with your strong hands in order to exploit them. And that concludes the YouTube portion of this video. If you guys want to learn 2 practical ways to exploit your opponents right away, then get the follow-up video on my website.